Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a philosopher or a king, but with something far more dangerous and complicated. Dating in the Middle Ages, because believe it or not, finding love in a time of plagues, daris, and chaperones was somehow even more awkward than texting someone. What you doing? At 2 a.m., from courtly love songs to marriage by livestock negotiation, medieval romance was less about butterflies in your stomach and a lot more about land rights and family alliances. It's a world where the search for a soulmate was a very, very different game. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a huge help and lets me know I should keep these long-form stories coming. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, low hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, imagine for a moment you're there. You're a young person, a teenager even, standing in a small medieval village. The air smells of wet earth and wood smoke. You can hear the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer and the lowing of cattle. You see someone who catches your eye and you think, how do I make a move? Maybe you strike up a conversation, or compliment their tunic, or ask if they come here often. You might even consider asking them to go for a drink, but the thought would stop cold in your throat. Because that's not how any of this works. If you're in the Middle Ages, dating, in the modern sense of a romantic journey, simply doesn't exist. You don't have a casual first date. There are no long, late-night talks or walks in the park to see where things go. No. Instead, your fate and your future spouse has probably already been decided. Your parents, or your lord, or even your abbot are already in the back room, deciding who you'll marry. They are haggling over the when, the how, and the how many cows it will take to seal the deal. If you're a noble, you've probably been betrothed since before you could speak. You'll be married to someone you've only heard about in rumors, someone you might not even meet until the wedding day. This wasn't just some quaint, old-timey tradition. This was a deeply ingrained system of social and economic survival. For the vast majority of people, marriage wasn't about love or companionship. It was about security. It was a business transaction, a way to secure alliances, to consolidate land, and to ensure a family's future. It was the ultimate merger and acquisition, with a few animals and a handful of dirt serving as the collateral. Happiness was not on the balance sheet. Think of it this way: your family's future literally rested on your marriage. For a peasant family, the right match could mean more hands to work the fields, a larger dowry of a few sheep or a pig, or even access to a better water source from a neighboring family's land. The deal wasn't about love, it was about ensuring the crops would grow next season and the family wouldn't starve. For nobles, it was about power, land, and political maneuvering. A noble marriage could unite warring houses, secure a strategic border, or even create a powerful new dynasty. The individual's happiness was a distant afterthought, if it was considered at all. You were a pawn in a real-life game of chess, a piece to be moved on the board for the greater good of your family name. The grand wedding ceremony, the fancy clothes, the feasting, all of it was a public declaration of a business deal that had been negotiated in secret for months, even years. At the heart of this system was the dowry. It was a transfer of property from the bride's family to the groom, or his family upon marriage. But it was far more than just a payment. It was a form of inheritance for the woman, and a powerful signal of her family's status. It was her nest egg, providing a form of financial security in a world where a woman had little to no legal standing. And the amount of the dowry was everything. A large dowry could make a less than desirable bride suddenly very attractive. It was the medieval equivalent of a prenuptial agreement, but instead of protecting assets, it outlined exactly what the bride brought to the table and what rights she had to it if the marriage fell apart. A girl with a large dowry was a valuable asset, while one without could be a financial burden. For the family of a poor woman, their only hope might have been a special public fund, like the Monte del Dotti in Florence, which helped provide dowries for girls who couldn't otherwise afford them. Contrast that with the bride price, a practice more common in some Northern European cultures. Here, the groom or his family would pay the bride's family for the right to marry her. It was a way to compensate her family for the loss of her labor. The value of a woman was determined by her ability to work and produce children, so a bride price was a direct, literal payment for her value as a future wife and mother. So, if you were a peasant, your courtship might involve your father and your future father-in-law sitting down, drinking some ale, and negotiating the price of a few goats or a handful of chickens. The romantic part wasn't the flirting or the stolen glances. It was making sure the livestock were healthy and the deal was fair. Everything was tangible. There was no romance to be found, only a transaction to be made. You'd probably meet your future spouse for the first time on your wedding day. You'd be standing there, probably smelling a bit like wood smoke and livestock, in a town square filled with people you'd never met. And then, without any prior conversation or connection, you'd have to make it work. There was no trial period, or seeing where things go. This was it for better or worse. And if you didn't have a good reason to get out, you were in it for the long haul. But this isn't to say that all romance was dead. Far from it. This rigid system of arranged marriages actually gave rise to a whole new kind of love. It wasn't the kind you could hold or express openly, but a very poetic and very, very distant kind of love. A love that existed almost entirely in the imagination. It was a fantasy, a way to escape the harsh reality of everyday life. This brings us to courtly love. This was a concept developed in the 12th century, largely by troubadours and poets. That was all about loving from afar. It was a total fantasy, a game played by nobles, and it had a very specific set of rules. It was a way to express emotion and passion in a world where marriage was about practicality, not passion. The rules of courtly love were simple, but strict. The love was always unconsummated, and it was almost always between a knight and a married nobler woman. The knight would perform brave deeds and great acts of heroism to honor her, never expecting anything in return. Think of it as a medieval fan fiction, a story of an unrequited love that fueled a knight's every action. The knight would worship the lady from a distance, writing her beautiful poems, and fighting in tournaments to honor her. The relationship wasn't physical, it was purely spiritual. It was a way to channel the passion and emotion that society forbade in a formal setting. It was a way to make life a little more interesting for those who had everything, and a knight would often carry a token from his lady, a ribbon, a scarf, or even a piece of her jewelry. It served as a constant reminder of their secret devotion, a physical symbol of a purely spiritual and idealized connection. This token was a secret, a symbol of a love that was beautiful precisely because it could never be. In fact, the term courtship itself comes from this tradition. It was the practice of a man trying to win the favor of a woman at court, not necessarily for marriage, but for her praise and affection. It was a social performance, a ritual dance where men and women could play a part in a romantic fantasy. It wasn't about finding a wife, it was about finding a muse. But even in this rigid society, people found ways to get out of a terrible situation. The church had a huge role in all of this. While they couldn't stop the arranged marriages, they did put some rules on the game. They created canon law, which set out the legal framework for marriage, and it was the church's law that provided the one small glimmer of hope for someone stuck in a bad match. The church declared marriage a sacrament, a holy union that was supposed to be consensual. This gave people a small loophole, a way out of a terrible arranged marriage. It was a small bit of power for the individual against the immense weight of family and society. It was the beginning of the idea that a marriage was a choice, not just a transaction. You could claim pre-contract, saying you had already promised to marry someone else. You could also claim non-consummation, basically saying the marriage was never physically completed. A lack of consummation, called a triennium in Latin, meant the marriage was never officially completed in the eyes of the church, so it could be annulled. Non-consummation was a big deal. If a marriage wasn't consummated, the church could grant an annulment, but proving this was incredibly awkward and could involve a physical examination or a public trial. To prove non-consummation in the church's eyes, you would sometimes be subjected to a public ritual where a panel of judges, doctors, and church officials had to investigate whether the marriage was truly unconsummated. One famous case involved a medieval prince who claimed his marriage was never consummated because he was physically unable to perform his marital duty. The prince's father had been pressuring him to produce a child, but the prince just couldn't do it. So he went to court where a panel of doctors and churchmen had to investigate. The whole affair was a public humiliation for the prince, but he eventually won his annulment. So, while the system was rigid, there were ways to navigate it. It was like a medieval version of It's Complicated, but with more plagues and less texting. The church's power, which sometimes felt like a prison, also offered a small glimmer of hope for someone stuck in a bad match. It was the beginning of the idea that a marriage was a choice, not just a transaction. Now let's step out of the castle and into a different story. This one involves a warrior queen, a great emperor, and a skull filled with blood. It's a story of a woman who stood up to a man who conquered the known world. It's a tale of a woman who refused to be a pawn in a man's game. A story of a woman who took a stand when no one else would. The year is 530 BC. The man is Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire. He was a force of nature, a brilliant military strategist who built the largest empire the world had ever seen. His conquests stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indus River Valley. He was a liberator to some, a tyrant to others, and he was known for his policy of respecting the customs of the people he conquered. He was a man who, by all accounts, was unstoppable. Cyrus had conquered vast territories, from Mesopotamia to parts of Central Asia. He was seen as a liberator by some, a tyrant by others, and he was known for his policy of respecting the customs of the people he conquered. He had everything a man could want: power, wealth, and an empire that was growing every day. But there was one thing he couldn't have, one thing he couldn't conquer. There was one group of people he couldn't conquer: the Massageter, a nomadic confederation living in what is now modern-day Kazakhstan. Their queen was a woman named Tomiris. She was the kind of woman that Cyrus had never encountered before. She was not a queen by bloodline, but by her own strength and skill. The Massageter were a fierce warrior culture. They were skilled archers and horsemen, and they had a reputation for being unbeatable on their home territory. For them, life was about survival on the harsh steppes. They were a people who lived in harmony with their environment, and they were not about to let a conqueror from a foreign land take it all away. Tomiris herself was a formidable leader. The story, as told by the Greek historian Herodotus, paints her as a powerful and proud queen, a worthy adversary for Cyrus. She was a woman who ruled in a world of men, and she was not about to be intimidated by a man who had conquered the known world. Cyrus, not content with his already massive empire, decided he wanted to conquer the Massageter. He proposed a marriage to Tomiris, but she saw it for what it was: a flimsy excuse to take over her kingdom. She knew that if she married him, she would become just another one of his many possessions. She would lose her freedom, her power, and her people. She rejected his proposal, and Cyrus, insulted, marched his army across the Syr Darya River. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and he was about to learn a very painful lesson. He had never been defeated in battle, and he was about to be defeated by a woman. Cyrus set a trap. He left a portion of his army and a large supply of wine for the Massageter to find. As nomads, they were unfamiliar with wine and got drunk, becoming easy targets for a surprise attack. This was a common tactic in ancient warfare, a way to trick your enemy into a false sense of security. But Tomiris was not a fool. Tomyris's son was captured in the skirmish. In a moment of both desperation and pride, he took his own life. This enraged Tomyris beyond measure. She sent a message to Cyrus, a chilling ultimatum. She was not a woman to be trifled with, and she was about to show Cyrus the true meaning of vengeance. She said, "Though you are insatiable for blood, I will give you your fill of it." It was a warning that Cyrus, in his arrogance, chose to ignore. He believed that he was unstoppable, and he was about to find out that he was not. The final battle was brutal and decisive. The Massageta, fighting for their homes and their honor, utterly destroyed Cyrus's army. It was a shocking defeat for a man who had never known a true military loss. The battlefield was a sea of bodies, and Cyrus the Great, the man who had conquered the known world, was among them. And what happened to Cyrus? Tomyris found his body, had his head cut off, and plunged it into a wineskin filled with human blood. "I fulfill my promise," she reportedly said. "You have your fill of blood." It was a final, brutal act of vengeance, a symbol of a woman who had been pushed too far. This story has become legendary. It's a tale of a woman who avenged her son and defended her people against the greatest conqueror of their time. It's a story that has been told and retold throughout history, a story that has been immortalized in art and literature. But here's the twist: this is just one account, and it comes from a Greek historian writing a century after the event. Other ancient sources suggest Cyrus died of a wound in battle or in some other mundane way. Herodotus, our source, was known for his colorful storytelling, and it's possible he embellished the story to make it more dramatic. The account of Tomyris is still the most famous, and it speaks to a deeper truth about the power of storytelling. It's a classic David and Goliath narrative with a gender swap. It's a story of a small, nomadic people who stood up to a massive empire and won. It's a story that has resonated for centuries, and it's a reminder that history is not always what it seems. It's a story that resonated so much that it's been immortalized in art, literature, and even modern statues. Think of the paintings by Rubens and other Renaissance artists that depict the dramatic scene. In these works, you see Tomyris standing triumphant over the defeated emperor, her face a mask of cold fury as she plunges his head into the bloody wineskin. The art world was captivated by her story for centuries, turning her into a powerful symbol of a woman's righteous vengeance against a male aggressor. The tale of Tomyris served as a moral lesson for centuries, a warning to great leaders not to be too proud. It's a reminder that even the most powerful men can be brought down by a determined adversary. For a long time, historians and artists alike held this story up as a sort of anti-conqueror narrative, a cautionary tale that the ambition of one man could be undone by the spirit of a single, fearless queen and her people. And the story of the Massageta also reminds us that history isn't just about empires and kings. It's also about the nomadic peoples, the cultures on the fringe who often get overlooked, but who had a profound impact on the world. The Scythians, the Massageta, the Sarmatians. These were not primitive tribes, but complex, horse-riding cultures with their own rich traditions and a mastery of the steppes that even the great armies of Persia couldn't match. This story about Cyrus and Tomyris is like a historical counterpoint to our last story. Instead of a rigid, land-based system where marriage was a property transfer, you have a nomadic people with a different view of gender roles and leadership. You have a queen who leads her own army, not just a pawn in a Game of Thrones. It's a tale of personal vengeance and a people's fierce independence, not a story of courtly love or family alliances. It shows just how vastly different cultures could be, even in the ancient world. The world was a patchwork of customs, beliefs, and ways of life. You had the settled, bureaucratic empires of Persia and Rome, and then you had the fast, fluid, and powerful nomadic cultures that roamed the vast plains, each with their own unique moral code. Now, let's fast forward a couple of millennia and talk about iron, fire, and a single golden spike. We're going to talk about something that changed America forever, the Transcontinental Railroad. This story isn't about love or conquest in the ancient sense, but it is about something equally powerful: connection, and the staggering cost of that connection. The year is 1869. The place is Promontory Summit, Utah. The air is crisp, and the crowd is a sea of top hats and bonnets. Two locomotives, the Union Pacific's one mundane, and the Central Pacific's Jupiter, nose up to each other, their cowcatchers almost touching. The dream of a railroad that could stretch from coast to coast is about to become a reality. This single event would forever change the map of the United States, shrinking a continent from a months-long journey to a matter of days. The idea of a railroad that could cross the entire continent was a dream for decades. It was more than a dream, it was a rallying cry for the nation. It was a dream of manifest destiny, the belief that America was meant to span from the Atlantic to the Pacific. With rails stretching across deserts, mountains, and plains, there was no longer a wild frontier. Everything felt reachable. Everything felt claimable. It made expansion feel not just possible, but inevitable. But it was more than a dream. It was a political and financial nightmare. This project was a massive undertaking, and it was fraught with incredible challenges, both human and natural. It was a brutal test of human will against the sheer, unforgiving scale of the American wilderness. We're talking about traversing scorching deserts where men died of thirst, and blasting through the granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains, a task so difficult it felt almost impossible. We're talking about bridging raging rivers and laying track across endless, empty plains. This was not a small task. It was a monumental feat of engineering, and it was paid for in blood, sweat, and endless greed. The government, seeing the strategic importance of the railroad, got involved. They passed the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, which provided huge financial incentives and massive land grants to the railroad companies. For every mile of track they laid, the government gave them huge stretches of land and bonds to fund the project. It was a deal too good to be true, and of course it was. This was a brilliant move, but it also opened the door to incredible corruption. The government gave the railroad companies millions of acres of land, some of the most valuable land in the country, land that could be sold to settlers and speculators for a massive profit. The companies, in turn, got rich. Men like Leland Stanford of the Central Pacific and Thomas Durant of the Union Pacific didn't just get rich. They became railroad barons, shaping policy, buying politicians, and building empires. They were the original CEOs, men who understood that a little bit of influence could go a long way. The most infamous scandal was the Credit Mobilier affair. It was a massive fraud scheme where the Union Pacific's top officials created a fake construction company, Credit Mobilier, and then paid it huge amounts of money to build the railroad. The money they paid to this company was far more than the work was actually worth. They then funneled the profits into their own pockets. To keep Congress from investigating, they sold shares of the fake company to powerful politicians at ridiculously low prices. The politicians got rich, the railroad barons got rich, and the American taxpayer was left holding the bag. The scandal exposed how deeply railroad interests were embedded in the government. It was a massive black eye for the Gilded Age, but it also showed the sheer scale of the money involved in this project. The railroad was a government-sanctioned ATM for a few powerful men. For the people actually building the railroad, it was a different story. The labor was brutal, dehumanizing, and incredibly dangerous. Tens of thousands of men, mostly Irish and Chinese immigrants, did the back-breaking work. They worked with pickaxes, shovels, and dynamite, enduring extreme weather and unimaginable living conditions. On the Union Pacific line, it was mostly Irish immigrants. They were digging, blasting, and laying tracks across the Great Plains, facing extreme weather and constant danger from both the elements and the Native American tribes, who saw the railroad as an invasion of their land. Their work was essential, but their lives were cheap. The Chinese workers on the Central Pacific line had it even worse in some ways. They were paid less than their white counterparts and were given the most dangerous jobs, like blasting through the unforgiving granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The work was so dangerous that it was said that you could tell where the railroad went by the bones of the Chinese workers. It's estimated that over 200 Chinese workers died building the railroad, often from dynamite explosions or falling from steep cliffs. Their contribution was immense, but it was often uncredited and unappreciated. They were a crucial part of the story, a story that would not have been possible without their sacrifices. But their names, for the most part, were never recorded. The Irish workers, while paid better, faced their own hardships. Their camps were often filled with violence and lawlessness, and their lives were cheap. The work was so hard that many men simply disappeared. It wasn't uncommon for fights to break out over a bottle of whiskey or a game of cards, and the work itself was a constant risk. It was a life lived on the edge, where a man's future was as uncertain as the next blast of dynamite. The railroad companies had a simple equation: more track laid, more money made. The government was paying them by the mile, so the race was on. Thomas Durant, the head of the Union Pacific, was a ruthless competitor who pushed his crews to the limit. His goal was to meet the Central Pacific as far west as possible, because every extra mile meant more land and more money. The work was a frantic, punishing sprint to the finish line. But the railroad didn't just connect the coasts, it also connected a wild frontier to the rest of the country. And in its wake, it created a whole new kind of town. These were not your quiet, picket fence villages. They were temporary, mobile settlements that sprang up overnight and disappeared just as quickly. They were the physical embodiment of the Gilded Age's raw ambition and lawlessness. These were the hell on wheels. Towns. They were temporary settlements that sprang up at the end of the rail line, following the tracks as they were laid. They were lawless, chaotic places with names like Hell on Wheels and End of Track. As soon as the tracks moved on, the towns moved with them, leaving nothing but a trail of broken bottles and forgotten memories. Imagine a town made of tents and makeshift shacks, filled with saloons, gambling halls, and brothels. It was a place where all the raw ambition and vice of the Gilded Age gathered, where men gambled away their wages, and where a gunfight was a common sight. It was a place with no police force, no mayor, and no sense of community. It was a place for the lonely, the desperate, and the opportunistic. They were called Hell on Wheels. For a reason. They were a mix of prospectors, opportunists, and criminals, all looking to make a quick buck off the railroad workers. The rule of law was a foreign concept, and a man's life was worth less than $1. These towns were a wild, chaotic mix of cultures and languages, all united by a single, burning desire to get rich. And of course, the railroad had a devastating impact on the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. The railroad cut right through their lands, disrupting their nomadic way of life and destroying the very ecosystem they depended on. For the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and other Plains tribes, the railroad wasn't a symbol of progress, it was a symbol of invasion. The biggest tragedy was the decimation of the buffalo herds. The railroad made it easy for hunters to slaughter the buffalo for their hides and for sport, with some hunters killing thousands of animals in a single day. In 1800, there were an estimated 30 million buffalo roaming the Great Plains. They were the lifeblood of the Plains tribes. By 1889, there were only a few hundred left. The buffalo were not just an animal to the Plains tribes, they were a central part of their culture, their religion, and their survival. The loss of the buffalo was an act of cultural warfare, a deliberate attempt to force the tribes to abandon their way of life and settle on reservations. The railroad also brought settlers, soldiers, and new diseases. It was a fundamental change that led to the end of a way of life that had existed for thousands of years. The railroad was a symbol of progress, but it was a progress that came at a terrible cost. It was a story of a country being built on the ruins of another. Yet, for all its costs, the railroad undeniably stitched the fabric of a modern America. It connected immigrants to opportunity, businesses to markets, and governments to distant territories. Before the railroad, it could take 6 months to get a message from New York to California. After the railroad, it took days. It transformed an experimental republic into a fully integrated nation. The iron rails didn't just carry passengers. They carried ambition, destruction, hope, and hubris. They were a physical manifestation of a nation's desire to grow, to expand, and to conquer. The railroad was both a triumph and a tragedy. It was a testament to human ingenuity and a symbol of human greed. And once those twin locomotives touched cow catchers in the Utah desert, the country was never the same again. It was a moment that changed everything, for better and for worse. The nation was transformed not by war or election, but by iron and fire. It was a time of immense change, driven by the ambition of a few powerful men and the back-breaking labor of thousands of others. The railroad was the engine of a new America, a country that was bigger, richer, and more connected than ever before. Now, let's circle back to our original topic, dating. But let's look at it through a different lens. What if we think about love and connection in the context of these three stories? The way we seek connection, the way we try to find our place in the world. In the medieval world, love was a luxury, a fantasy for the rich. For everyone else, it was a strategic alliance. There was no room for individual desire. Your feelings didn't matter. What mattered was a good dowry, a strong family name, and a successful business transaction. The system of arranged marriages and dowries was designed to secure a family's status, not a person's happiness. It was a cold, hard, economic reality, a brutal system where people were treated like pawns in a game of chess. Yet, even within that rigid framework, people found ways to express their feelings. The troubadours and the poets of the courtly love tradition created a space for emotion to exist, even if it was in an idealized, abstract form. They built a whole world of romance in their minds, a world where love was a thing to be cherished and celebrated. It's a reminder that no matter how much society tries to dictate our lives, the human need for connection and romance always finds a way to break through. It might be in the form of a secret poem, a hidden token, or a quiet glance across a crowded room. Love, it seems, is an uncontainable force. Then you have the story of Tomiris and Cyrus. This isn't a story of romance at all, but of power, pride, and vengeance. Tomiris's rejection of Cyrus's marriage proposal was a political act, a defense of her sovereignty. It was a woman refusing to be a pawn, a queen refusing to be a possession. It's a powerful statement about a woman who refused to be a pawn in a man's game. She chose her people's independence over a marriage that would have ultimately led to their subjugation. She knew that by saying no to Cyrus, she was inviting war, but she was also protecting the very thing that defined her people, their freedom. And in the end, it was her personal grief over her son's death that drove her to her ultimate act of vengeance. Her story is a testament to a different kind of love, a mother's fierce, protective love for her child. That love wasn't a courtly ideal or a political alliance. It was raw, primal, and powerful enough to topple an empire. This story is also a reminder that history isn't always neat and tidy. The accounts we have are often coloured by the biases of the people who wrote them. Herodotus's version of events might be a bit of a dramatic flourish, a grand tale meant to entertain and to teach a lesson about the dangers of hubris. It's a compelling story, but not necessarily a verifiable fact. But it's a flourish that tells us something important. It shows us how different cultures viewed power and how a nomadic queen could be a more formidable opponent than any great city-state. It tells us that power isn't just about land and armies. It's also about a fierce spirit and a willingness to fight for what you believe in. The final story, the Transcontinental Railroad, is a story about a whole country. It's about a nation coming together, but also about the incredible cost of that union. It's a tale of how a single project can change everything: the landscape, the economy, the very soul of a nation. It's a story of labor and exploitation, of ambition and corruption. The connections being forged weren't just between two coasts, but between different worlds. It brought the industrial East into direct contact with the Wild West, and it created a new kind of American landscape, one of railroad tracks, telegraph poles, and vast, empty plains. It's a story about the destruction of a way of life. The railroad's path was marked by the near extinction of the buffalo, the displacement of Native American tribes, and the rise of a new corporate class. The railroad wasn't just a mode of transportation, it was a force of nature, a metal serpent that slithered across the country, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The hell on wheels towns were a chaotic testament to the raw energy and greed of the time. They were a physical manifestation of the moral compromises made in the name of progress. These were not places for families, they were places for people with nothing to lose, a transient world of vice and violence that existed only as long as the railroad needed it. And yet, for all the tragedy, the railroad was also a symbol of incredible hope. It brought new opportunities to immigrants, allowing them to travel to new homes and find work. For many, it was a lifeline, a way to escape poverty and to build a new life in a new land. It made it possible for people to move across the country in a matter of days, not months. It opened up new markets for farmers and businesses, and it allowed for a national economy to truly take shape. Before the railroad, America was a collection of regional economies. After the railroad, it was a single, interconnected market. So what do these three stories have in common? They are all about connection. Whether it's the personal connection of a marriage, the political connection of an empire, or the physical connection of a railroad, each story shows us the different ways we seek to connect with each other and with the world around us. They each show us how we, as a species, try to find our place in the world. We build relationships, we create empires, and we forge new paths. We're always trying to bridge the gap between ourselves and others, to find a sense of belonging, and to leave our mark on the world. And in each story, there is a core tension. The tension between tradition and change, between love and power, and between progress and destruction. These tensions are a fundamental part of the human experience, and they are what make these stories so timeless and so powerful. The medieval world was ruled by tradition, the system was rigid, and the individual was subordinate to the family and the state. But even then, people found ways to express their individuality. The courtly love tradition was a way to rebel against the system without actually breaking the rules. The story of Tomiris is about a direct confrontation between an ancient nomadic tradition and a new, expanding empire. It's a clash of different worlds, different values, and different ways of life. It's a reminder that not all progress is good, and that some traditions are worth fighting for, and the railroad is the ultimate story of change. It was a man-made force that altered the landscape, the economy, and the very fabric of society. It was a physical manifestation of progress, a symbol of a nation's unstoppable march into the future. It was a force that couldn't be stopped, for better or for worse. It's fascinating to see how the same human desires, for love, for power, for progress, play out in such different ways across time. We are all driven by the same basic needs, but the way we fulfill those needs is constantly changing. In the Middle Ages, you had to negotiate your marriage like a trade deal. In the railroad era, you had to negotiate with robber barons and politicians. And in Cyrus's time, you had to negotiate with a queen who would cut off your head if you crossed her. It all comes back to a core idea that history is not just a list of facts and dates. It's a collection of stories about people trying to navigate their lives. It's about the choices they made, the challenges they faced, and the legacies they left behind. It's about the young noble who has to marry a stranger, and the knight who writes love poems to a married woman. It's about a queen who fights for her son and her people. It's about the railroad worker who risked his life for a pittance, and the robber baron who got rich off his labor. These are the stories that make history come alive. It's about the Chinese immigrant who blasted through mountains for a pittance, and the railroad baron who bought politicians to get rich. These are the stories that make history come alive. They are not just tales of great men and grand events, but also of the everyday people who made them possible. They are the stories of the forgotten, the marginalized, and the exploited. They show us the human experience in all its complexity, the moments of triumph and the moments of tragedy, all woven together into a single, complicated tapestry. It's a tapestry of love and loss, of hope and despair, of ambition and betrayal. It's a story that is messy, unpredictable, and ultimately deeply human. And for me, that's what makes history so compelling. It's a never-ending series of stories, each one a window into a different time, a different way of thinking, and a different way of living. It's a way to travel through time, to walk in the shoes of someone else, and to see the world through their eyes. We can look at these stories and see echoes of our own lives. The awkwardness of dating, the desire for love, the struggle for power, the relentless march of progress. We are all, in our own way, a part of these stories. We are all, in our own way, trying to find our place in the world. We can see that the problems and emotions of the past are not so different from our own. They just manifested in different ways. The anxieties of a medieval peasant, the rage of a nomadic queen, the desperation of a railroad worker. These are all emotions that we can understand and relate to, even though the context is completely different. So the next time you're swiping on a dating app, or reading about a major corporation, or seeing a news story about a conflict, take a moment to think about the historical context. Think about the stories that came before and the stories that are still being written. Remember the medieval peasant whose marriage was decided by a few cows. Remember the Massageta queen who stood up to the most powerful man in the world. And remember that these stories are not just in the past, they are a part of us. And remember the railroad workers who laid the track that stitched a nation together, brick by brick, mile by painful mile. Their labor, their sweat, and their sacrifices are a part of the legacy we live with today. These stories are a part of a larger narrative, the story of humanity itself. And it's a story that is still being written every single day. We are all, in our own way, characters in this grand, sweeping epic. As we wrap up tonight, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey. It's an honor to share these stories with you, and it's a privilege to be a part of this community. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It really helps me out, and it lets me know that you want to see more of this kind of content. And let me know in the comments which of these stories you found the most interesting. Was it the awkward medieval dating, the badass queen, or the epic tale of the railroad? I love hearing your thoughts. It's a privilege to be a part of this community, and I'm always grateful for your support. Your comments, your likes, and your subscriptions are what keep me going. So from me to you, I wish you a peaceful night and a good rest, and I'll see you in the next one.